Hello, everyone. I now shall open the session on Israel. The three talks refer in diverse ways to novel technologies and to new ways, technologies in genomics and genetics, and to new ways of conceptualizing human diversity, but they do so in the context of Israeli society. The first talk provides a more general framework, implicitly drawing an analogy between groups considered socially and culturally disabled and disability discourse, within which the two ensuing talks relate directly to disability issues. Our first speaker is Dr. Yali Hashash, historian and gender scholar, founder and head of the Gender and Criminology program at Or Yehuda College, the author of Whose Daughter Are You? Ways of Speaking Mizrahi Feminism. At present, she is a fellow at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Please, Yali.
So in the following, I will discuss the legacies of eugenics in Israel as a discursive framework that is concerned with the quality of Jewish citizens in Israel. This discursive framework was both a rhetorical means through which middle-class Jews, mostly of European descent, Ashkenazi Jews, made claims for state resources, and a pseudoscience framework that expressed the colonial Orientalist and modernist epistemology that saw Europe and the West as a developed and progressed and the rest as undeveloped and backwards. Israel was established in 1948 as a Jewish nation state, following a war through which and after which the majority of Palestinians were expelled and not allowed to return. At the same time, the mostly Ashkenazi population in Israel was to grow through massive immigration of Jews from all over the world. Before World War II, Jews of Arab and Islamic countries constituted around 10% of world Jewry, while European and American Jews constituted 90% of it. But by the 1950s, Israel had already populated a quarter of world Jewry and supplied half the fertility rates of the Jewish people, making it central to the demographic regeneration efforts in the post-Holocaust era. Israel's Jewish population was rapidly changing. If in 1948, the overwhelming majority of the country's Jews were of European descent, according to the 1961 population census, the ratio between Jewish ethnicities has changed dramatically. Ashkenazi Jews comprise only 52% of the Jewish population in Israel, and furthermore, 60% of births were of Mizrahi women from Islamic and Arab countries. As a result, in 1961, the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, nominated several Israeli experts from various academic fields, demography, health, education, welfare, and economics, to form a natality committee that will discuss the state of children in large families on the one hand, and the suggested means to encourage Jewish fertility on the other hand. The Natality Committee quickly reframed its mandate as one that concentrates on suggesting measures to encourage the reproduction of those who were most valuable to the new nation's economy and culture, while regulating the reproduction of Mizrahim, Jews of Islamic and Arab countries, and the lower classes, whose children were depicted as culturally and economically liable to become a burden to society. This was on the one hand very binary, Oriental way that reflected intrinsic bias on behalf of the speakers, but it was also a rhetorical framework that allowed to continually disregard the fact that Mizrahim were pushed by the state to proletariat positions, enabling a rapid movement of Ashkenazim to the middle classes. Professor Roberto Bacchi, the head of the Central Bureau of Statistics and a demography scholar in the Hebrew University, headed this committee. Among the high-ranking state officials who were nominated to the committee, the accepted division between low and high human quality followed a clear colonial and modernist logic. Quality consisted of ethnicity, Western middle-class culture, and financial capability. But while European Jews were imagined to have it all, the women of the middle classes were too lazy, as they put it, and had to be tempted into having the third child. At the same time, the underdeveloped population seemed to be having as many children as time allowed, burdening the public with the care for these children. Just to say that the data that was brought to the committee was actually manipulated, and that wasn't a true depiction of the reality. The gap that was quickly disappearing on its own was framed as unjust, and the committee was resolved to address that injustice. The Natality Committee has convened after a decade-long state efforts to manage the Mizrahi population that was on the one hand needed as working bodies for manual labor and as bodies to settle the borderlines of the new country, but at the same time was seen as a threat due to the Arab culture, imagined diseases, lack of modernity, and overall low quality. A large-scale operation to eradicate ringworm disease, for example, among Arab Jewish children, was in play until 1960, putting approximately 100,000 children under a month-long radiation regime that went way over the acceptable radiation norms of its time. The excess and unnecessary treatment was operated by Dr. Chaim Shiba, who was also an enthusiastic participant in the selection of Moroccan immigrants between 53 and 56, making sure that only the young and healthy will join the new Jewish national body. When discussing Israeli policies in its first decades, whether publicly or academically, we often forget, though, that the global political and cultural processes that have shaped the views of Israeli leadership, especially as much as it relied on professional discourses. In the 1960s, the leading high professionals in education, economics, social work, health, medicine, or law were educated between world wars in European capitals. The institutions that where they got their respective PhDs, whether it was the London School of Economics, the Vienna Medical School, or the University of Berlin or Amsterdam, were all invested in the eugenic discourse as a necessary policy informer. Indeed, eugenics as a modernist discourse was as much prevalent in social democratic circles as it was in fascist ones, proponents of it all agreeing that reproduction was a state business that necessitated the involvement of policymakers in the areas of health, welfare, education, etc. Having said that, that is, while bearing in mind that Israeli high professionals were very much a product of their European education, it should be noted that not only professional education influences were at play, but also colonial legacies and class interests, which allowed for the sharp change of heart in the 1960s. Let me give an example. The Natality Committee of the 1960s was not the first Professor Baki had headed. In 1943, the Health Department of the National Jewish Board in Palestine had already established a Natality Committee after different research conducted, mostly by Baki and his students, had shown a low fertility rate among Jewish women. This committee had completely different outlook on the issue and had recommended pro-natalist propaganda and a welfare system that will ensure social and economic security in all Jewish strata in the country, through, for example, offering families with children increased salaries. In the 1960s, however, these recommendations, some of which were made by the exact same officials, were much more concerned with regulating Mizrahi fertility rates, recommending to establish family planning services, and avoiding direct money transfers to large families whose heads, it was said, were likely to use the money for alcohol and gambling. Eugenic attitudes informed, but were also used as pretext when gynecologists looked for a population to distribute experimental IUDs to in the 50s and 60s, and whenever public resources were needed by hegemonic groups that portrayed themselves as useful and needed, and therefore entitled to governmental investments. All the while, through the decades, the traditional modernist framework that bound together economic and population planning was at play. When neoliberal economy began to bloom in the mid-80s, welfare budgets that were finally released for the first time in the mid-70s came under scrutiny and were gradually cut to their now lowest levels yet. And another case at point, in the 2000s, following a wave of immigration of Ethiopian Jews, The medical, economic, and population experts have again joined forces, and through the Joint, an American Jewish philanthropic organization in Ethiopia, and the Health Ministry in Israel, administered Depo-Provera injections to Ethiopian women, mostly without informed consent, relaying to the new overwhelmed women immigrants that in Israel it is not customary to have many children. Most women were not introduced to any other contraceptive. The result was a steep decline in fertility among that population. Finally, the matter was reported in the press and later researched and lobbied by the feminist Haifa-based organization Isha Leisha. The Depo-Provera is a long-term contraceptive that was administered across the world to mentally and intellectually challenged women and to African women whose reproduction governments wish to regulate by the injection. To some, eugenics was a common conceptual framework for much of the leading high governmental officials in Israel who were educated in the European capitals between world wars, whether in pre-fascist regimes or in social and communist ones. Being acculturated in the colonial settings of Europe and functioning as the interest holders of their class, high Israeli officials believed that Mizrahi population introduced a threat to the desired modern character of the Israeli state, and at the same time made sure that state budgets will remain as much as possible in their own group, the middle classes, and not distributed as welfare budgets to large families. The overall message was and still is that children are only as dear to the state as they are financially dear to their parents. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Our second speaker is Professor Sagit Mor, who is the head of the International Center for Health, Law and Ethics and the director of the program in Law and Health at the University of Haifa, Faculty of Law. Her areas of expertise are disability studies, disability rights, tort law, and bioethics. Please, Sagit.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. I titled my talk, The Right Not to Have a Disabled Child. And I would like to discuss in my talk questions regarding the relationships between prenatal testing, abortion, and wrongful life, wrongful birth claims in Israeli law, and connected to issues of bioethics, of eugenics, and disability. I would like to open with just presenting the fact about Israeli penal law, which criminalizes abortion unless it meets certain grounds. And if the decision whether it meets those grounds is made by an administrative committee, the Committee for Termination of Abortion and of Termination of Pregnancy. And one ground is that the fetus, one ground that the abortion might have a permit is that the fetus might have a mental or physical disability. In this talk, I show that in Israel, there is no general right to abortion, but rather a limited right to abort a pregnancy on grounds of disability. And I would like to get into this by starting with a general discussion about disability, bioethics, and eugenics. So disability and bioethics, disability theory, disability studies, and bioethics share a common history that they grew out of the lessons of World War II and the Holocaust. So the lessons after World War II were that the person or the patient should be at the center, the rise of human rights, discourse and human rights treaties in the international community, and a clear rejection of eugenics as a valid social theory. This clear rejection of eugenics is usually understood as rejection of racism, and it took time for disability theory and to show that eugenics is basically about ableism, not less than it's about racism, and that underneath this understanding of eugenics as a manifestation of racist theory, there is a very strong rejection of disability in society. And even for bioethics, it took a lot of time to understand, and it's still a struggle today to make bioethicists recognize that disability is not merely a health or medical category, but rather a social category, a socially constructed category that is a result of social, cultural, historical, economical processes. And when we think about disability and bioethics, and as we shall see more also with regard to eugenics or new eugenics, we see that the disability is relevant to many bioethical discussions at the beginning of life, the end of life, and even throughout the life course, when we think about access to healthcare and questions of prioritization of medical treatment. So in this talk, I would like to focus on the beginning of life, of course, because this is the subject of this discussion. And when we think about the beginning of life, we think in these days about the new eugenics. But I would like to say a few words about the old eugenics, even though many of you know what the subject is. From a disability perspective, it's important to know that the three pillars of eugenics theory from the mid-19th century to the 20th century were sterilization, institutionalization, and termination. Sterilization was a way not to give birth to more disabled people. Institutionalization was a way to exclude disabled people from society, mainly for the reason to prevent them from intercourse and from having more disabled people in society. In some places, disabled people could be released from institutions if they were submitted themselves to sterilization. So there was there was an ongoing issue of forced sterilization, but also people who were voluntarily willing to sterilize in order to leave institutions. And termination, which was an organized program only during the Nazi regime with the T4 program. It was a program of killing disabled and sick persons, and that was the first program, the killing program of the Nazi regime that only later was extended to Jews and other social groups. The central category of early eugenics was the feeble-minded, which was a loose category that included disabled persons, the poor, criminals, immigrants, all kinds of others, that the boundaries between them were not as clear as they are today, even though today we also have questions of not so clear boundaries, but there it was just like a very fluid category of others that were threatening the purity of the race, of the nation. But as we said, after World War II, eugenics was, as a racist theory, was rejected. And but the new eugenics emerged in the late 20th century with the rise of new prenatal testing, or forms of testing, which were not available before. And the goal of the new eugenics is basically preventing the birth of disabled persons, disabled children, through prenatal testing and abortion. But the way to do it is not by forced actions by the state, but by extending choice against disability and other unwanted traits. And we know today that these traits are extending and extending. So we know now that it's not only about disability, it's the questions about which traits we allow people to choose against or for is a question of all these new genetic and other reproductive technologies. The main logic of this new eugenics is a logic of market, of consumer choice, of private choices made by individuals. But the effort of the disability critique, disability theory, is to put these choices in a context, to show that these choices are not just individual choices of what kind of child I would like to have, but are shaped by also by social and cultural assumptions about the perfect baby, or the baby that we would like to have, and also the socioeconomic background against which we decide whether to have a baby, which shapes our choices, like what kind of life we will bring a disabled child into, and what kind of options they will have, what kind of education, and what burden it will put on the family, especially in states where their socioeconomic infrastructure is insufficient, or just demands a lot from families who are having disabled children. So if we look closer into the disability critique of prenatal screenings, we can see that it has like three aspects. We can discuss more, but I think that it's easy to put it into three bullet points, three aspects. There's the moral critique. I follow here Adrienne Ash's work. The moral critique of prenatal screening says that disabled lives are of equal value and that prenatal screenings devalue disabled lives. The misinformation critique criticizes assumptions about life with a disability, claiming that they are misguided, that we basically don't, the dominant or the hegemonic non-disabled or ableist ideology assumes that life with a disability are life of misery, a life of suffering. Well, they in reality, many disabled people live fulfilling lives that have, of course, pain, but also pleasure. And it's also misguided because if we would live in a society that promotes disability rights and provides people with disability with all the services that they need, so their life would be better. So we're making assumptions about the society we have now and not based on the society that we could have. And the third level is the material critique. So I mentioned the moral critique, the misinformation critique, and the material critique, which emphasizes that disability is a distributive issue, that the socioeconomic conditions affect the experience of disability, and that we cannot talk only about the value of life with disability without acknowledging the material conditions, questions about access, about poverty, and about the welfare state. So before I continue, I just want to make some distinctions about some clarifications about the relationship between the disability critique and the feminist critique. So it's very important to understand that pro-disability is not pro-life. Pro-disability critique is a disability that puts the social construction of disability at the center. There's no reason to find contradiction between disability rights and women's rights. Usually they go together hand in hand in questions of autonomy, self-determination, and bodily integrity. Like gender, disability is a social category. This is the main this is the news here, that what disability activists, disability theorists called feminists is to acknowledge that disability too is a social category, not merely a medical category. And one thing that can help us distinguish or find this common ground between disability and feminist critique is saying that the N is adopting again Adrienne Ash's notion of the any but distinction. If a person is not interested in a pregnancy because a pregnancy is not what she or they want at this point, this is morally acceptable. There's no contradiction between the disability critique and the feminist critique here. But if a woman or a person or a couple are not interested in a pregnancy because of disability, this is where it becomes problematic, and this is where we can even compare between not wanting to have a fetus or a baby because of disability and because of gender. So there are some common grounds here. And the disability critique extends along the lifespan of the pregnancy, the pregnancy life, what we can call now the tentative pregnancy. Disability inspection at the beginning of life can start with genetic testing even before marriage or before having a partner to have a baby with. It can happen before pregnancy. It can happen after conception, genetic testing. We have lots of blood tests. We have amniocentesis. And today we have the NIPT technology of non-invasive prenatal testing. We have questions about sperm and egg donation, what kind of test we will have, about PGD, about surrogacy. In each of these situations, a disability critique or disability questions may arise. For example, if we can force a surrogate to have a prenatal testing, if we can force a surrogate to have an abortion, if she conducts prenatal testing and we discover it's a child with a disability and the ordering person is not interested anymore in this baby. So we have lots of questions about disability throughout the lifespan. And if we go specifically to Israel, we can see that in Israel the prenatal screenings is very pervasive, very extensive. There's the term, the quest for the perfect babies, that Remnick has coined, that we know that in Israel people are very even obsessed with prenatal testing. There's world record of checkups and screening. There's social anxiety around the pregnancy, whether there's going to be a disability and whether an abortion is needed or wanted by the baby. The reasons for that are vast. It's very hard to know why exactly this cultural environment happens in Israel. There's the reason of the Holocaust, people say, because the Jewish part of Israel, the Jewish people suffered extinction, so they now want to get bigger, but they still don't want to. They want to be a healthy people and not a weak people, as ironically was perceived by eugenic Nazi ideology. There's demographic uncertainty in Israel. There's a nation building project that is ongoing, and there's the Zionist background of creating or building the new Jew, the new that is strong, that is productive, that is European-like, that can take part in this nation building project. So in Israel, pregnant women are eligible and expected to perform extensive prenatal screenings. Prenatal screening is funded by the National Health Insurance Program, and there are additional screenings offered by the private market. Now, with all that, we go to Israeli abortion law. So according to Israeli abortion law, Israeli criminal law, elective abortion is prohibited. It criminalizes only the doctors, the physicians who are conducting, not the person that is having the abortion. And there's a pregnancy termination committee that can grant a permission for abortion based on grounds of age, below marriage age, or above 40, a danger to the woman's health, circumstances of pregnancy like rape or out of marriage relationships, and this very big and vague concept of the fetus might have a physical or mental defect. And it's interesting that in Israel, despite this formal prohibition of abortion, in fact, the abortion committee authorizes 98 to 99% of the requests for termination. So in practice, it's quite easy to have an abortion despite the official restrictive approach. And all exceptions apply at any stage of the pregnancy. There is no difference between, there is some difference that I will not touch, but according to the law, there's no difference between early stages of pregnancy and later stages of the pregnancy. And there's a very, the option to have, so while informally there is no right to have an abortion in Israel, there is a right basically in law to have an abortion based on disability, which will be provided at almost any time. It's a very permissive practice with regard to disability. And this, what I would like to say also, is further protected and further enhanced by the wrongful life and wrongful birth claims in tort law. So I hope I can finish it in a few minutes. Wrongful life claims are claims brought by a person or a child who asserts with a disability, who asserts that because of her disability, she would have been better off not being born at all. So this is a kind of a tort claim that is possible only in certain countries. And in Israel, it was possible for 25 years from the end of the 80s to the 2000s. And next to wrongful life claims, we have wrongful birth claims, where the parents assert that they rather have an abortion than raising this child. Wrongful birth claims are very common in most Western countries, unlike wrongful life claims that are usually prohibited, exactly because they bring this very negative message about life with a disability. So in 1986, the famous Zaitsev case in Israel allowed wrongful birth and wrongful claims into Israeli law. And for 25 years, under this decision, many lawsuits were accepted based on the claim of the person, of the disabled person herself, usually brought by the parents, that she would rather not being born. In 2014, a change in that case law, a change in doctrine occurred in the middle between 86 and 2014. We had the rise or the revolution of disability rights, and also a general rights change in constitutional change in Israel. We had in 1992, we had basic law, human dignity and liberty. In 1998, we had the equal rights for persons with disability law. And in 2006, Israel signed and ratified the International Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons. And then in 2012, sorry, not 14, 12, the Hammer case, the Supreme Court said we're not allowing any more wrongful life claims, the claims that a person said that they would rather not be born, but we allow wrongful birth claims, which is the claims that parents say we would rather have terminated this pregnancy. Wrongful birth claims are easier logically and legally because this is an actual option that this couple or these parents or parent didn't have because the disability, I didn't say that before, disability was not detected during pregnancy, so they could actually claim that if disability was detected, they could have an abortion. What I would like to conclude with is that the critique of prenatal testing and of abortion based on disability is valid for wrongful birth claims as well. There's a continuing moral critique because both wrongful life claims and wrongful birth claims are expressing the same message that it is better not to have a disabled child. And the critique of wrongful life claims that it still have an impact on medical practice to prevent the birth of disabled to prevent the birth of disabled children. And this also leads to allocation of resources to prevention rather than to promote and enhance rights of disabled people. So if I want to go back from lessons from wrongful birth to abortion, which is also a question that is very strong now in the Dobbs era, in the post-Roe era. So I would like to suggest that even if abortion law changes and becomes more permissive regarding women and men's control over their destiny, disability-based abortion will remain a debated political and social issue. And restricting disability-based abortion is not a solution, but rather changing the social, political, and legal climate within which such decisions are made through disability rights and adequate support and social services. Thank you very much.
You talk. The next speaker is Dr. Nili Breuer, who is an academic director at the Center for Disability Studies at the Paul Brevald School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her PhD in Disability Studies is from the University of Illinois in Chicago, where she was a recipient of the Ethel Louise Armstrong Scholarship Award. She is also a disabled activist and a scholar artist. Her main research interests include critical disability studies, cultural studies, disability art and culture, performance studies, feminist theory, autoethnography, and stigma. Please, Nili.
Thank you, Snait. And Benedict, you can upload the PowerPoint also. Eugenics as a theory for the improvement of the human race focuses its action on the stage of procreation. The concept was that biology is what holds the secret to the quality of the person that will be born. This approach obviously prioritized biology while disconnecting the body from culture and erasing it from any social context. The disability movement identified the similar move in the way society perceives disability. According to the individual model of disability, the disability resides solely in the body and or the mind of the person. In the slide on the screen, it's the second one, there is an image that illustrates this individualistic way of thinking. Brittany and Abby Ansel, conjoined twins from the USA, are drawn in a way that disconnects their body from any social context. They are found in a white space that lacks any characterization. Their body undergoes a process of medicalization and becomes a specimen on display. They are stripped of their skin so the clinical gaze can penetrate the flesh and observe their internal organs. The organs are counted as in an inventory, and the body supposedly reveals its own inherent pathology. In the next illustration, number 3, please, we see a similar cultural imagery. The painted fetus is also cut off from any context and seems to be floating in a vacuum. I suspect that this cultural imagination is not accidental and that it serves the hegemony. Disabled people do not live in a vacuum, out of context. Embryos are not created in space, but inside the womb of a woman whose body carries within it a history that is always also social. As a response to the prominent and dominant individual model, disabled activists demanded that society be put back in the frame, and so the social model of disability was designed. Through this model, the disability movement redefines disability as oppression and points an accusing finger at the exclusionary and discriminatory society. As illustrated in the next slide, the step has become a symbol indicating the barriers that society places in front of people with impairments and thus transforms them into disabled. The photograph on the next slide, number 5, please, returns the body of Brittany and Abby to the concrete social space. I felt obligated to add it also to my PowerPoint and to show the differences between the two pictures, the two images. I opened this paper by pointing out the ultimate preference given by eugenics to the reproductive phase. I claim that this preference is based on a narrow hegemonic view that identifies disability only in the body and is not willing to admit the decisive role that society and social systems play in creating disability. Firstly, at the level of conceptualization, secondly, at the level of solution, and thirdly, at the level of prevention. First, at the level of conceptualization, it is essential to understand that disability as a category is socially constructed. In the current period, it seems that medicine has a developing ability to identify and predict genetic disabilities as well as prevent them. But in practice, the category of disability is not a stable scientific truth. There are human differences, There are human differences that will culturally be identified. Sorry, my body is also speaking in its own way. So there are human differences that will culturally be identified as medical impairments, while others will not. In addition, the determination of the severity level of a disability is unknown through genetic testing. Ultimately, I believe that the severity of a disability is fluid and relative and cannot be determined objectively even later during a disabled person's life. Disability is not a certain and fixed reality, but rather an intersubjective, dynamic, constantly changing, and context-dependent reality. Again, my voice becoming an illustration of itself, of this approach. I'm sorry, I will cough a bit. So today, science managed to identify variation from a limited and fixed genetic sequence that is marked and constantly constructed as standard and normal. But this measure is not a scientific fact, but rather a cultural ableist determination. In fact, scientific knowledge is biased toward disability and very limited in its capacity to identify disabilities. Second, regarding the ability to provide solutions, it clearly depends on how the problem is defined. As we have seen, the individual model identified the problem in the person herself, and therefore the answers are determined in the realm of medical intervention. According to this approach, the ideal solution would be a complete cure in which the disabled person returns to the standards and normal state of being. However, the social model places the problem in an entirely different arena. By redefining disability as oppression, society is identified as the primary source responsible for the creation of disability. Thus, the required solution to disability is a deep and structural social change. Thirdly is the issue of prevention, and this is the point I want to emphasize. Although science is busy discovering the genetic components of various disabilities and disease, including those that can develop during life and not necessarily at birth, for example, cancer and dementia, it still seems that most disabilities are not innate, but acquired. This is in itself explained that disproportionate attention reproductive technologies receives in relation to other systemic issues that might prevent disability. Furthermore, the social model in its British version distinguishes between impairment and disability. Quite similar to the feminist distinction between sex and gender, the social model established the distinction between impairment as a difference within the body-mind and disability as institutionalized oppression manifested in an inaccessible environment, stigma, exclusion, and discrimination. The binary distinction has received significant criticism, and in this lecture, I wish to strengthen the claim that impairment is not only biological. It is also created and constructed within a global, social, economic, and historical context. We need to recognize that poverty, exploitation, and environmental pollution cause chronic disease and disabilities in which the most vulnerable are people in multiple minority groups and third world countries. In the next slide, number 6, please, there is a photo taken in Congo of a person who seems to be a pregnant woman and a number of children around who burn waste. I took this photo from an article about a report indicating that plastic pollution is causing a health crisis in poorer countries. Social and environmental factors have real effects on our body minds, and even more in the ways that they can alternate and change our children's genetics. When we accept this truth, then focus can shift from a micro to macro, from an individualistic conceptualization to a systematic structural conceptualization of inequality on a global scale. For me, the question of whether or not to give birth to a child with a disability is a troubling one. Being a disabled scholar, activist, and artist, I find great value in the social model and in its supplementary model known as the affirmative model of disability. The latter model defined disability as an identity that is established belonging to the disability community. The affirmation promotes an empowering process of reclaiming disability, attributing positive meaning to it, and feeling a sense of pride toward it. Under this framework, disability is reconceptualized as part of human diversity that should be celebrated. The following slide, number 7, shows example of slogans and stickers that indicate deaf pride and also disability pride. Nevertheless, having a dominant genetic disability that has been passed down in our family for generations, I found myself fearing the possibility that my disability would be passed on to my children. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I hoped and wished that my genetic mutation would not pass on to her, and that she would not have to deal with the pain and difficulties that I experienced both on a physical and social level. Since science still does not know how to identify our family mutation, I was not required to make a conscious choice in the matter, but I remained ambivalent and conflicted about the issue. However, I am learning that a critical discussion about eugenics should not be reduced merely to this liberal question of whether or not to give birth to a child with a disability. Moreover, I understand that criticizing eugenics need to go far beyond the issue of procreation. Approaching the subject of disability prevention from social justice framework pushes the question of how we reduce disabilities and chronic disease caused by extremely poor living conditions. Even when I'm aware of the tension that exists here in relation to the affirmative model, I risk recognizing disability, or at least some disabilities, as an undesirable condition in order to promote a more just world. It seems that the great promise attributed to reproductive technologies is more indicative of an utopian eugenic fantasy of a future without disability than a possible reality. Disability will always be a part of human existence. It will continue to be a part of our future and the future of our children. So we need to expect it, accept this, and be prepared for it. I call us to respect the vulnerability of our body and mind, and know how to deal on a personal level as well as on a collective level with the fear, difficulty, and pain that such a complex reality contains. In the fight against eugenics, it is important that we create a tolerant and inclusive society for disabled people, for the entire diversity that characterizes our species, and for the inherent vulnerability in each of us. At the same time, it is essential that we recognize the inequality and injustice that create disability and disease, and that we work to reduce the harm to human beings and to the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neely. So now I would like to pose questions to the three of you, and you can choose which question you want to deal with. And I think we should give each of you something like 4 minutes to discuss the questions and to discuss your point of view among yourselves. So I think that all three of you agree on not accepting the premises of eugenics, and either individualized or collective, or when applied to people with disabilities or applied to groups that are made to look as if they are disabled. So my questions are the following. The relations between, what are the relations, in your opinion, between appeal to emotive, ethical, autonomous and family well-being, individual components, and collective, emotive, nationalist, military, medical, scientific components in the rhetoric of Israeli state and its institutions when they deal with reproduction? Because the Israeli rhetoric has appealed to both individuals on various levels and to collective elements. And I think we have to deal with both of them. My second question deals with practices. The role of economic, social, and hegemonic nationalist in state practices in implementing the implicit assumption of eugenics? And how do you think people with disabilities and groups considered otherwise disabled could be differently addressed within Israeli society? The third question is about the role and status of science, scientificity, and technologies deemed scientific in shaping and fashioning social and legal norms and hegemonic discourse in Israel. So you can address either the issue of rhetoric or practices or social norms and discourse in Israel concerning how the state, it's all the questions concern the state, how the state approaches the public as individuals, as collectives, both in rhetoric, in practice, and in fashioning social norms, for example, concerning science.
Okay, I can start. Okay, so there are several things I can relate to. The first is that when it comes to reproduction, the Israeli situation in the past 20 years is very different to the situation a few decades ago, because now it is very normalized to have large groups that are ideologically pronatal, which means that the pronatalism of those groups is not is less concerned with questions of even economic viability of large families, but are guided by ideological means, and these groups are very much supported by other groups in the world, like evangelical ideologies that promote this kind of ideology. So it's very different to the situation that I described in the 50s and 60s, where most of the reproductive decisions by most of the Jewish people in Israel were taken in a less committed ideological framework. Not that there weren't any ideological underlying ideologies, but they weren't that decisive. Like it was a bit more flexible. So that's one reality that we need to relate to when we speak about reproduction in Israel. The other thing that I want to relate to is the technologies. In Israel, the medical institution is very highly regarded by governments on whatever side of the spectrum they come from. And that means that they are not as regulated as they could be, and that the interest of medical research and medical expansion on social realms is very much promoted by different governments. So you have very universal interests of the medical establishment that has to do with the need to do well on an international arena or to have a groundbreaking research or whatnot. And you have the, national ideology. And usually the national ideology will be used by medical establishment as a pretext for enlarging the realm of their playground, where they to avoid regulation. So scientists have a very, very detrimental part in everything that has to do with reproduction, whether prenatal testing, whether stem cell research, genetic research, modification of embryos before they are born, anything that is expanding the ways that the medical establishment can go into the reproduction process and eventually maybe create their own non-human reproductional processes. So until that is regulated in a much more conservative way, I think there's not much that they won't do. It's not for like it's not something that you need to leave for a professional to decide whether they're crossing the line or not. It's a policy thing, and policies tended to go after the scientists instead of putting some brakes to them.
Yeah. So you're actually saying that the admiration of science or scientificity actually shapes social and legal norms in Israel.
Yes.
I think that from a disability perspective, the role of the state is very important. So we cannot get rid of the state, even though the state has a role in oppressing, limiting, even terminating. We must think of the state as also an enabling force, because disability rights depend on affirmative duties by the state to make accommodation, to restructure the environment and the built environment to make it accessible. We need the state to force people not to discriminate. So, but at the same time, we have this problem that it's very naive to expect it from the state, because historically it was part, and still today, even rights ideology, right? Not just the state, the rights ideology was very excluding and exclusive. So we have these high expectations of social and political institutions who were historically oppressive, but we still have to have some optimism with regard to these political forces, and we have to be optimistic in some way about the way the state that it can also serve unprivileged or disadvantaged communities or minorities, because otherwise we cannot. I don't trust the market, the invisible hand of society to support minorities. So we are in this very in this ambivalent position about the state, where we would like to be optimistic, but we are also pessimistic. So it's a kind of like a dual consciousness about the state. And the same thing we can say about science. I think that science supports disability in many ways. It supports disabled people in technologies, in supporting technologies, in making places accessible. But at the same time, technology is also disabling when we have computers. So people who cannot use the computer, so people who are blind become disadvantaged in a society that builds on computers, unless we make the internet and everything accessible. So even so technology is a way to diagnose the disability, but at the same time it's a way to treat disability. So it is a question of how we what we do with those instruments, with science, with the state, with our own understanding of disability. And I think that disability is really at this cross, at this intersection of being optimistic and pessimistic about what state and science can do to make lives better.
Yeah. Neely?
Yes, to continue with the Sagit point, I will take the more pessimistic, I think, approach toward the state and also science. So it seems that in Israel and also in the Zionist myth, there is a demand for overcoming. The Jewish people was being seen in Europe through anti-Semitism as weak, as sick, as queer, as pale, and through the Zionist movement, there was an effort, as also Yali and Sagit already said, there was an effort to create a new Jew. And this Jew was supposed to become a very ableist, heterosexual, young and strong image of a man that succeed to overcome is Jewishness in a way. And this approach is also very strong in Western society, including Israel, toward disability and disabled people. We are all the time being demanded and being applauded, like we are being demanded to become more normal and so our abilities in spite our disabilities, and this is a discourse that oppress disabled people in so many ways. We are all the time need to perform the strong and capable parts of ourselves, and as I said in my paper, vulnerability become very minimized and unlegitimized in this culture. And the science also takes a significant role in this. Israeli military industry is also working on finding solution for disabled people that were injured, partly in the military, but not necessarily, and finding technologies that can fill the gap between the disabled and the normal, and even go farther beyond and give us new abilities. It's an enhancement technology that we are now seeing the Western world working on. And I suspect, I'm not the only one who say that, but I believe that this is going to actually deepen the inequality in our global world. It's going to have to create a product that people, not only disabled people, are going to pay for it and already paying for it. It's also the medical industry that is part of this enhancement technology to perform a better abilities and to become a superhuman, as the discourse goes. And other people and other nations will not have the same access to this technology. So the gap and the inequality, the injustice are just becoming deeper and larger through this national industry and international industry of technology, new technology.
Do you want to react to that, Sagit or Yali? Do you want to react to the others in any way?
I kind of agree with both speakers. I think, yes, we need to expect the state to intervene and to regulate. And not only the state, but also international bodies. Because medicine is an international occupation, and because the research is not bounded by territory, international regulations are extremely important for anything that happens in one state. And I agree with the bleak projection of Neely that yes, I think it's true. I think also just like reproductive technologies have developed on a pretext in Israel, on the pretext of pronatalism, and basically what they did is to enhance research in intervening technologies. The same way, I think to help disabled people and find technologies to make their situation better is a pretext for all this technology of enhancement that is very dangerous and very scary. And it is, I think, our duty as researchers and to promote some kind of an international statement that requires regulation on all these arenas.
But how would you react to the possibility of changing the social environment itself, not particular technologies, but pressuring the state to change the social environment itself? Do you think that would be helpful?
I think that's a brilliant point of view that Neely suggested, to shift the entire discourse into the causes of human suffering and disability. And yeah, I can't but concur.
So shall we conclude? Do you want to say anything, Sagit?
No, I just think that because we had this framework of eugenics, I think that while eugenics is like an outdated term because we have all this history that is associated with eugenics, we need to think that when we think about a future, a better future, which is a future without disability or without certain groups, is a future that is very, very problematic because disability is part of the human condition and because the diversity is part of the human condition. I think this is where I would like to end this discussion, go back to eugenics and understanding this point.
Yeah, I agree. That's why one has to change social environment and not the capabilities of particular individuals in that social society.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nate.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Snade, and thank you, Benedict.
Yeah,
And thank you to
Nate.
Benedict for organizing this whole conference, which is really amazing.
Bye-bye.